Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are digging into a huge piece of news that really dictates the future for, the entire virtual care sector.
Absolutely. We're talking about the latest extension for telemedicine prescribing of controlled substances from the DEA and HHS.
And it's this announcement that, on the surface, looks like good news. A bit of breathing room.
It is, but it's really a double-edged sword. It provides some much-needed certainty for now, but the reason we need another extension, well, that tells a much bigger story about what's coming.
Right. And that's our mission today. We want to get past the headline and really break down what this means for investors. What are the compliance hurdles and, the real risks that people need to be thinking about now?
So let's start with the basics. The DEA, working with HHS, just announced what is now the fourth temporary extension of these COVID-era flexibilities.
Fourth one.
And this is a critical lifeline. For digital psychiatry, for pain management, for addiction treatment, this is everything.
So the key date is moved again. What's the new timeline we're working with?
The old deadline was December 31st, 2025. They've now pushed that out a full year, all the way to December 31st, 2026.
An extra year. Okay, so let's unpack what that status quo actually is. What does this extension let companies continue to do?
The big thing is that DEA-registered practitioners can keep prescribing Schedule II through V-controlled substances remotely.
And that's through audio-video, right?
Right, audio-video, and this is key, without needing that initial in-person medical evaluation. So if you're a telehealth company prescribing, say, ADHD meds, your business model is safe for another year.
And there's also a really important piece here related to the opioid crisis, which the agencies seem to be prioritizing.
Oh, absolutely. The rule makes a special point of covering medications for opioid use disorder, or OUD.
And how does that work?
So for those specific drugs, prescribing is allowed even with just an audio-only call. That is non-negotiable for reaching patients in rural areas where broadband is still a huge issue.
The official reason for the extension is, ensuring continuity of care while they finalize a permanent rule. It makes sense. But 4 extensions? That tells me this is a really hard problem for them to solve.
It is. And to really get why it's so difficult, you have to rewind to what the law was before the pandemic.
So what was the baseline?
The baseline is a law from 2008 called the Ryan-Haight Act. And you have to remember, this law was designed to shut down those rogue internet pharmacies, the ones just handing out prescriptions.
Its whole purpose was about preventing diversion, not expanding access to care.
Precisely. And under Ryan-Haight, the rule was simple. No in-person exam, no remote prescription for controlled substances. The COVID waivers just completely suspended that requirement.
And that suspension created this multi-billion-dollar boom for digital health.
It did. It enabled business models that just couldn't have existed before.
So this extension just kicks the can down the road. But the DEA did try to create a permanent rule earlier this year, and it was a mess.
It was a spectacular failure. And that's where this gets really interesting for investors, because that failed attempt tells us what the DEA is thinking. They released 2 rules in January 2025, and the industry just erupted.
Let's start with the one for buprenorphine for OUD treatment. That one seemed like a step in the right direction, didn't it?
It was a mixed blessing, really. On one hand, it was great. It got rid of the general in-person visit requirement for OUD and even expanded the first prescription to cover 6 months.
Which is huge for access.
Huge. But it also created this incredibly dangerous care cliff.
Okay, walk me through that. Why a cliff?
Because after those first 6 months of virtual care, the rule said the patient either had to get an in-person exam or be transferred to a provider with a new special registration.
But that special registration, it didn't even exist yet, right?
Exactly. It was just a proposal. So you're telling a patient in, say, rural West Virginia, we'll help you for 6 months, but then you're on your own. It was guaranteeing a massive, dangerous disruption in care.
And that brings us to the second rule, the one that actually proposed the framework for that special registration. This is the one that really terrified the market.
DEA 407. Yes. This was the DEA's vision for the future, and it signaled a huge regulatory contraction. The restrictions in that proposal are the things that I think we have to assume will come back in some form in late 2026.
Okay, let's go through them. What were the big roadblocks in that proposal that have CEOs so worried?
The first one was the proposed exclusion of primary care doctors.
Right.
Yeah, the rule basically said PCPs, who are often the front line for mental health in rural areas, wouldn't be eligible unless they met some really vague, most compelling use case standard.
So right off the bat, That just slashes the potential market for any telehealth platform trying to operate at scale.
Completely. It forces specialization. The second big issue was the arbitrary prescribing quotas.
This is one I remember, the 50% rule.
Yes. No more than 50% of a doctor's monthly prescriptions could be for Schedule II drugs.
Which, for a psychiatrist specializing in ADHD that's just not workable, is it?
It's clinically unworkable. You're forcing doctors to either turn away patients who need help or basically start cherry-picking less severe cases just to meet some administrative number. It penalizes specialists.
And then for the big national companies, the third point was just a killer. The geographic restrictions.
This was a big one. It proposed that the clinician had to be physically located in the same state as the patient.
Which defeats the entire purpose of telehealth.
It completely guts the model. The whole point is to connect a specialist in Boston with a patient in rural Montana. This rule just makes that impossible overnight.
And beyond all the clinical rules, there were the administrative hurdles. The fees.
The fees were excessive. They proposed an $888 registration fee, plus more fees for every single state you wanted to practice in. For a small practice, that could easily be thousands of dollars. It's a huge barrier.
And the last one, the technical one that just seemed impossible to implement, the PDMP data.
This was a perfect example of a rule that sounds good on paper but is a nightmare in reality. They wanted practitioners to check the prescription drug monitoring program data from every single U.S. jurisdiction before prescribing.
Why is that impossible?
Because these state databases, they don't talk to each other. They're all different fragmented systems. You're basically asking a doctor to manually log into and search 50 different websites for every single prescription. It's not feasible.
So to sum it up, the extension is great, but the future looks like it will be full of compliance hurdles and restrictions. The national scale model seems to be directly in the crosshairs.
That's the big takeaway. But there's also a dual threat timeline here. And one of the deadlines is much, much closer than the DEA's.
Let's talk about that because this is crucial. The DEA extension is until the end of 2026. But what's this other cliff?
The Medicare telehealth flexibilities. These are the rules that actually dictate whether a virtual visit gets paid for. And those were only extended through January 30, 2026.
January 2026. So that's much sooner.
Much sooner. And we're talking about really fundamental things like allowing the patient's own home to be a valid site for care, or getting paid for audio-only visits for things other than behavioral health. If those go away in early 2026, it doesn't matter if the DEA lets you prescribe, you won't get paid.
So that's a logistical nightmare. You have a reimbursement cliff in January and a prescribing authority cliff in December of the same year.
Right. And you could argue the Medicare cliff is the bigger immediate threat to a company's bottom line.
So this extension isn't a victory lap. It's really just a transition period to prepare for a much tougher environment.
I think that's exactly right.
Okay, this gives us a lot to think about. Let's shift gears now. It's time to put on our speculative hats for our This Is Not Financial Advice segment.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, we are not advocating any trades, just exploring a plausible idea based on everything we've discussed.
So our core thesis here is that when the dust settles, regulators are going to favor public health, specifically the opioid crisis, over the business models built on national scale.
You think the final rule will look a lot like the restrictive one they proposed?
I think it will retain a lot of those elements, yes. The quotas, the state-based restrictions, I think they'll be back in some form.
So how do you turn that thesis into a trade?
We call it the compliance hedge. It's about shorting the models that are most vulnerable to these changes and going long on the ones that seem to have a regulatory safe harbor.
Okay, let's start with the short side. Who's most at risk here?
The short side would be targeted exposure to the big national telehealth platforms that are built on prescribing Schedule II drugs, like ADHD stimulants, across state lines. Their entire model is based on the scale that these new rules would kill.
So the idea is that the quotas and the same state rules will just crush their margins and shrink their addressable market.
Precisely. You're betting against the business model that is most directly threatened by the DEA's likely direction.
And the long side of the hedge, where's the safe harbor?
The long side is specialty providers who are narrowly focused on opioid use disorder or maybe complex pain management, especially in rural areas.
Why them?
Because everything in the DEA's language and the broader political conversation points to protecting access for OUD treatment. It's a public health crisis they can't afford to disrupt.
So you're betting that any final rule will have specific carve-outs or protections for SUD and OUD treatment.
That's the bet. That public health necessity will shield them from the worst of the regulatory crackdown. Essentially, the DEA will balance access versus diversion by giving OUD a pass while coming down hard on the high-volume cross-state models. And this extension gives you the perfect timeline to set up that hedge.
Okay, to recap the key takeaways then. The DEA has extended the telemedicine prescribing flexibilities until December 31st, 2026. That buys everyone a lot of time.
But the more immediate cliff to watch is the Medicare one. Those flexibilities are only guaranteed through January 30th, 2026. That is the urgent threat to reimbursement.
And it seems clear the entire regulatory landscape is moving, slowly but surely away from the emergency waivers and toward a permanent and likely more restrictive framework.
The whole debate really comes down to this. What does the DEA prioritize in the end? Is it administrative oversight and control, or is it public health access?
One final thought for you to chew on. We've been talking about what the DEA and administrative agency is doing, but there are actually 4 different bills floating around Congress right now that could create permanent telehealth rules through legislation.
That is the ultimate wild card. Will Congress step in and force the DEA's hand to prioritize broad access? Or will the agency's cautious, restrictive approach win the day? That tension is really the biggest risk factor of all.
A perfect place to leave it. Remember, everything we've discussed today is for informational purposes only. It is not financial or legal advice.